patiently while YouTube does its thing. And yes, I think we are now live. It says live in the top left corner. If anyone, usually just wait for like a comment. If people can press 1 or something in the comment section just to let us know that you can see us. I think there's a slight delay as well, so it might take a while. Not seeing anything yet. Actually, another way we can check is we can just open the live stream.
We are live now.
We are live. Okay, cool. Great stuff. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to SoCo. We are very, very honored today. JC isn't here, but I will be here for JC, hosting this live stream. We have Mel from Islamic Origins, and we have Dr. J. Smith with us to talk about the origins of Mecca. And we are going to be arguing against what we would call the S.I.N, the standard Islamic narrative. We are of the position that that is completely wrong, that the standard Islamic narrative is not actual real history. And we think we have good arguments to prove it. I'm going to introduce myself really quick here, and then I'll pass on to Mel and then to Jay to introduce themselves. And, oh, yep, I can see all the comments now. Great stuff. So, my name is Chris. I am Chris from Speaker's Corner. I have been a Christian for, I think, 13 years now. I was an sort of early, well, I say early, back in 12, 11 years ago, I was a apologist and a polemicist for Christian polemics against the sort of secular atheist perspective. That's something that I was very much interested into. And then back in 2015, I happened to take note of Dr. J. Smith's work on the Islamic origins. I was kind of interested in that. And then a couple of years ago, I decided to come to Speaker's Corner, both to evangelize and have a ministry towards Muslims and also anyone else there from any other particular faith background. And that's pretty much me. We'll pass over to Mel.
Yeah, so I'm Mel from Islamic Origins, formerly Speaker's Corner. And I named it Speaker's Corner originally because I used to go to Speaker's Corner, and I had been inspired to go there because of Dr. J. I watched one of his videos and got really interested in the idea that there was holes in the narrative. And eventually I started a channel, and I've been eager to find the holes in the narrative ever since. So I think I've been involved in this for the last 7 years or so, maybe 8 years actually now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it.
Nice. And now on to you, Dr. J. Smith.
Yeah, well, I think I'm the old man here. I was at Speaker's Corner since 1992. So for 25 years, I used to go down there. Back in the 1990s, we were very few, maybe 3 or 4 of us who were taking on hundreds of Muslims at a time, much more volatile at that time. This is before Islam had that narrative of being peaceful. And we didn't really engage in the historical critique. That's something that's only come out in the last few years, and primarily because of all this new material that's coming to light from such a enormous number of researchers, scholars who are bringing it to the fore. So much so that we decided, at least on Pfanderfilms, that we would start really zeroing in to the historical critique concerning Mecca, concerning Muhammad, and concerning the Quran, those 3 areas, about 2019, 2020, and I haven't stopped. This has been exciting, and that's why it's great to finally meet Chris. I think, Chris, you and I met, what, a year ago? Was it a year ago?
Yes, I believe so, yeah, roughly that, yeah.
And Mel, of course, I know Mel since 2013, 2014. So almost 10 years we've known each other. And Mel has been really good because he is probably really is our best researcher amongst the sin sifters. He just goes and goes and goes and just pulls up so much new material and keeps my head spinning. So it's been terrific having Mel on board. And of course, on this subject especially, this is going to be exciting.
Great stuff. Well, it's a pleasure to have you both here. I am absolutely honored to have both of you, in honesty. I've been watching you guys for a long time, as you know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of questions that I'm just going to pose generally, both to you guys and to the audience. And just a heads up, we are perfectly happy to take questions. If you guys have questions, don't be afraid to ask them in the comments. I'll be looking at the comments section, and anything that you guys want to ask, I'll be displaying it. All that I ask is that you keep to the topic. We're talking about the origins of Mecca from a historical perspective. We are also willing to take on any challenges from any Muslims out there who feel as if we're wrong about what we're saying, and they can back it up. If you feel that you can challenge what we're saying, then by all means, let us know. I can even get you on here possibly, and we can have a chat. And yeah, we'll see how this goes. So I guess the first question I kind of want to pose to you guys is, what are the Muslims' main claims about Mecca and its history and its central place for Islam? I don't know which one of you wants to sort of jump in with this, but
maybe Jay there on that one, I think.
Okay, let me go ahead and just introduce this. We don't have to go to a PowerPoint or anything. I'll just do it off the top of my head. I think the biggest claims that they are making concerning, well, obviously, Mecca, according to chapter 7, verse 24 in the Quran, you have Adam and Eve, they're in the Garden of Eden, and it says at that time that they were thrown down. Thrown down where? Thrown down to earth. If you look at the traditions, Eve was thrown down to Mecca and Adam was thrown down to what is today Sri Lanka. And then he rises up, he's about 90 meters tall, and strides up across the countries, in the intervening countries, and joins his wife there in Mecca at the Hill of Arafat, which is one of the reasons they now pray at the Hill of Arafat. So if obviously this suggests, or this is very clear, that Mecca would be the oldest inhabitant in history. There's no one older than Adam and Eve, according to both the Quran, chapter 7, and according to the traditions. In the Quran as well, in chapter 21, verses 51 to 71, you have Abraham there in Mecca rebuilding the Kaaba with Ishmael. Now, in every one of these cases in the Quran, it doesn't use the word Mecca, but it just Musaf al-Sharif. In the Quran itself, in the oldest traditions, that's what is there in chapter 21. But it's suggesting that this is all Muslims believe that this is in Mecca. That's why we have to go with what their claims are. That would be chapter 21. And also it says that this place was a place of Jahiliyyah, a place of ignorance, according to the biography of Muhammad. If you look at Ibn Hisham's biography, just look on page 54 to 61 and also 700. Mecca was a place of decadence. It was a place of ignorance. And that's why when Muhammad was born there in 570, according to Ibn Hisham, he received these revelations in 610 to bring back this period of ignorance and bring it back to the original ethos that Allah had initiated from the very beginning. This is in Mecca. We do know also that the Hajj was always incorporated in Mecca. We know that Abraham, according to the traditions, in Sahih Muslim, book 1, hadith number 21, you have reference that Abraham is there redoing the Kaaba with Ishmael. So that would be 1900 BC. And then according to if you look at Ibn Hisham, according to all the accounts that we're getting in the traditions, Mecca was the center of trade. It was a center of trade, north, south, east, and west. So it would have been a pretty important city by the time Muhammad was born there in 570 and lived there until 622 when he moved to Medina. There are also reference after reference. I don't know if I have the time to go into it, but you have reference that it is the first sanctuary. That's in chapter 3, verse 96. It's the mother of all settlements in chapter 6, verse 92 of the Quran. It is also where Sodom and Gomorrah's ruins are outside of. There's a pillar of salt. That's in chapter 37. It is where the center of the Qibla was. When you look in chapter 2, verse 142 to 150, you will see that Qibla was moved first to Jerusalem and back down to Mecca. So these are pretty important. Then when you go to the traditions, you will see it's just the traditions really support an enormous amount of vegetation in Mecca. It's in a valley. It has a stream going through it, according to Al-Bukhari. It has fields, according to Al-Bukhari. It has trees, grass, fruit, clay, loam, grapes, grain, and even pomegranates, both according to the Quran and also the traditions. And it has olive trees, which is very curious, according to Surah chapter 6, verse 99 and chapter 16. So when you look at all these references, this is a city that is the oldest city in history. This is a city, according to Islam, where Adam and Eve were. This is a city where Abraham lived. This is a city where all the trade went through, that they controlled. And it was a city that was full of vegetation and had lots of water. Now, can you see, these are huge claims. And these are the claims that we are going to confront today. Because if these claims exist as they are, they're written down, as we're not making this up, we will support everything that we're saying. Then, of course, Muslims need to have to support this, all these claims, but support them from the 7th century. Support them from the 7th century, not from the 9th and 10th century, because all these claims that I've given to you come from the Quran and the traditions, which are much too late. The Quran, we don't know when the Quran was written. We do know that the earliest manuscripts are all 8th and 9th century, but the traditions don't even begin to get written down until the 9th and 10th century, until Ibn Hisham in 833, until Al-Bukhari in 870, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and the others at the end of the 9th century, until Al-Tabari in the 10th century, 923. So you can see, everything that we know about this place, Mecca, comes from these traditions and that Quran. Those traditions don't even begin to appear until the 9th century, continue into the 10th century for that which is happening in the 7th century. And that's why we're confronting it. You cannot depend on those traditions. They're just too late. What's more, look and see who wrote them. Look and see who the writers. Where did Ibn Hisham live? Well, he was born in Basra, grew up in Cairo, but he wrote in Baghdad. Where did Al-Bukhari live? He comes from Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan. Where did Al-Tabari live? He comes from Tabaristan, which is northern Iran today. These are hundreds of miles away, and hundreds of years later, they are just too late. And that's why we're confronting Mecca. They do not have the right place, nor do they have the right time. And also, they don't have the right climate, nor do they have the right history. And that's why we need to be able to then bring this forward so Muslims can hear it.
That's great stuff. What I think is really, really important to highlight there's actually quite a lot to highlight there, but I think the fact that we're saying we value the historical method, we don't really care about these later sources that come from the standard Islamic narrative. We want to know exactly what was happening within the 1st or 2nd century. We don't want to look later to the 9th or 10th century, because that's just too far removed from what was actually happening at the time. And I think that's a really key point here. And I think, that was amazing stuff. Mel, do you have anything to add to that, or shall I ask on the second point?
Well, just that if we look at the 7th century witnesses, if everything that Islam claims is true, then we should have no problem finding witnesses that corroborate all of those claims. But what we find, we find contradiction after contradiction after contradiction, and that should raise red flags for any Muslim that's watching, because if their faith is centered on history, if it is actually based in some sort of reality, then we should find it relatively easy to prove every claim that Muslims make in the standard Islamic narrative. But I've been working on this for years with an open mind, really, to find the evidence, thinking that, well, maybe 90% of it would be proven in the historical evidence, but actually finding every time going away empty-handed. And actually, on top of that, finding a contradictory claim. I'm sure Jay has had the same experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting. I'm just going to quickly show this question on screen here. At Pfanderfilms, will Muslims be able to go on to challenge these claims? Yes, if you are a Muslim and at any point we say something that you would like to challenge on live stream, you can do so. I can put the link that you guys can then join, or you can type your question into the comments, and we can bring that up and we can address it as well. Cool. So moving on to the next kind of point. So when we think about Mecca, we think about its place geographically, right? And the area around it and what that kind of means. So what are the geographical issues with Mecca? What can we talk about regarding its geography in particular? So I have a few things I could say about this, but I'm sure you guys can as well.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well,
Go on. I'm going to take this one.
Okay.
This is an easy one. See, this is why I'm taking this one. So there are a few things that immediately spring to mind. The first is actually its geographical position relative to everything we know from the traditional places of Jewish worship and homage. So, for example, pretty much Israel, right? So Judah and Jerusalem. And when we look at the Temple Mount, we look at these places and we know geographically they are, I believe it's something like 600 miles, if not more, removed from where Mecca is. So there's a distance problem for one question. Another geographical point that just springs to mind is the fact that there isn't what you would consider living conditions for a large amount of people to be able to reside in Mecca or to make pilgrimage to Mecca in such a way that you could sustain these kind of populations that you would naturally expect given the accounts from the standard Islamic narrative. Because we're not talking about the middle of nowhere. We're not talking about a tiny little area that has no significance whatsoever. We're talking about somewhere which is supposedly a major place of worship at some point in history, to which then became a paganized symbol of worship, again, still for many people. So there needs to be a way in which this can be sustained. But we know from for example, studies from Mars, right? If there was ever life on Mars, what would it need to have? It would need to have water. Mm-hmm. But we know from looking at the geography of Mecca, there simply isn't the amount of water needed because of the lack of rivers, the lack of fresh water sources to be able to sustain that kind of population. I'll let you guys jump in if you want to.
Go ahead, Mel.
One of the things I discovered when I looked into that water question is there was a story about Queen Zubaydah, who was the wife of one of the caliphs. I think it was Al-Rashid. And she lived in the latter half of the 8th century. So she visited Mecca, probably in one of the earliest ones to visit Mecca, to be honest, probably only existed for a few decades. And she reported back that there wasn't enough water for the pilgrims who were there. Now, I would imagine in those days, the amount of pilgrims that were going there would have been quite small in comparison to nowadays. But she was quite upset with the lack of water there. And she spent the equivalent of about $1 billion in today's money building 2 aqueducts, which were finally completed in 801. So I would challenge Muslims who are watching to explain to me, how could a population survive out of a well that couldn't even support a relatively small number of people, especially because there would be spells where there was no rain for months and months. So I think that's a big question there that needs to be answered.
Yeah, as far as the geography, this is where Dan Gibson has been so helpful. He, in his book on Quranic geography, the name itself implies what it's all about. He looks at the 65 geographical locations, 65 references in the Quran. When you look at the Quran, it says very little, but what it does say is problematic. He notes that of the 65 references, 24 of them refer to this prophet who has contact with these people from Thamud. What is Thamud? Thamud is the name that we use today for Nabateans. The Nabateans, way up in Jordan. He mentions that that this prophet doesn't give it a name, doesn't give him a name. It just says this Nabi, this Rasul, has daily contact in some cases, with these people from Ad, which are the people from Uz, what we know in the Bible as Uz. Look and see where they're located. And then, of course, about 7 times, he has contact with people from Midian. So you have Thamud, Ad, and Midian. When you look at a map, you will see that all 3 of these people are up in what is today Jordan and what is today Israel. That is 600 miles further north, 600 to 1,000 miles further north. So geographically speaking, if this prophet has contact with these people that many times, either he had a helicopter or he had a plane to fly up there and back in the day, which didn't exist in the 7th century. You can see it's almost impossible, other than the fact that possibly whoever wrote the Quran was living that far north, was living in that area where you would have this kind of contact. So there are some real problems geographically speaking, but there are other difficulties as well. When you look at spinning off of what Mel said on the water, and you mentioned this well as Chris, it's not just that there's no water, it's a desert. And when there's a desert, there's no vegetation. When there's no vegetation, there are no people, no towns, no cities, no civilizations, no history. In order to have history, you need to have people to write it. You need to have large groups of people. You mentioned that, Mel. When you look at all the scholarship that has been done on that Hijaz, that central area of Arabia, that western central area that includes both Medina and Mecca, both of them or in the middle of a desert where there was nothing that could there were none of this vegetation that I just listed off, where you have in the traditions. You don't have any of these fruits, these pomegranates. There are no olive trees at all outside of the Mediterranean world. And we're down 600 miles too far south to have olive trees. Yet you can see 3 times in the Quran it refers to olive trees, and the prophet is eating from these olive trees. So you can see there's a problem here, just pointing and showing where it is on a map. But don't just stop there. Muslims have come back and they have said, well, we have the Zamzam well, the Zamzam well. You've heard this. And I would love maybe one of you to unpack that. What is the problem with the Zamzam well? I think you wanted to get into that, Mel.
Well, yeah. If I can share a couple of slides, there's a few anomalies with it. If can you show my slides, Chris?
Yeah, yes, I can. Here we go.
So I just want to show you, well, the following. So I thought the Zamzam well had an inexhaustible source of water. Then why is it that Queen Zubaydah that I mentioned had to commission these 2 aqueducts? That's the first problem. And also, if the Zamzam well is this inexhaustible source of water, why is it that Saudi Arabia is the largest producer, not just one of the producers, but the largest producer of desalinated water in the world? So you can see there that it produces 3.3 million cubic meters of water a day, which is 1.2 billion meters of water a year. If the Zamzam well has got this endless supply of water, why waste all that money on desalinating the water? Why don't they just put a massive pipe down there? There's also an awful lot of mythologies that really make me suspicious about the whole Zamzam thing. So I'd just like to just go to one example. Let me just get to this one here. So this is a Chinese source, and it just is part of the myth making that has gone on in Islam right through the centuries. So there was a story about the Zamzam water recorded during the time of the Ming Dynasty. It was told by a Muslim actually traveling to Mecca. So it's dated to 1433, but it gives us an idea of the sort of differing beliefs. So I'll just focus on this bit here. It says, behind the grave of Muhammad is a well, a spring of pure and sweet water named Abi Sansan, which people take to mean the Zamzam. Men go to foreign parts, take this water and store it at the sides of their ships, which kind of indicates a kind of level of superstition. If they meet a typhoon at sea, they take this water and scatter it, and the wind and waves are lulled. Now, if we leave aside the magical dimension to all of this, there's a clear contradiction here with the standard Islamic narrative, which says that Muhammad is supposed to be buried in Medina. And here we have this alternative tradition where Muhammad is buried supposedly next to the Zamzam well. So this is typical of the standard Islamic narrative where they can't even get their story straight. By the time we get to the 20th century, they finally seem to have some sort of a story, but there are lots of different seerahs and so forth. I better not go off on too much of a tangent here, but it kind of gives you an idea of the myth making around the Zamzam well. So I hand it back to Jay.
Yeah, let me just go ahead and put up my slide here. See if I can do that from my slide. My computer.
While Jay's doing that, I just want to jump in. When we look at Queen Zubaydah and we look at what she was trying to do to actually provide enough water for these pilgrims, I think that is evidence overwhelmingly that this is a new issue that they've encountered. They never had this before because there simply wasn't this pilgrimage. This wasn't occurring. Then it started to occur, and then people needed the infrastructure. They needed these things in place to sustain that kind of pilgrimage.
Yeah, and it was a slow burner. They had a blank slate with Mecca, and you know they could get away with making up this story because there was no one around in Mecca to contradict them.
Okay, I have a full screen. Can you see my full screen yet?
I think you may need to remove mine.
Yes, but I don't see anything from you yet, Jay.
All right, let me try it again.
No worries.
I go to share screen, right?
Yes. And then you find the tab. Was that the way you did it?
No, I didn't do that. Okay, let me try it again.
Oh, did you upload the file?
Okay, let's let it go. I'm not going to be able to get it. What I want to take off from what people have been saying on the Zamzam well. Mel talked about the fact that it's inexhaustible. That actually is what we're hearing all the time from lots of Muslims. There you have that famous clip that you can go on David Letterman's show where he had David Chappelle back in 2020, a few years ago, and asked him the question about the Zamzam well. And David Chappelle, who I think he's a great comic, he's a convert to Islam, and he made the comment there on stage with David Letterman that this Zamzam water is inexhaustible. In other words, it continues. It will always continue eternally, and it maintains enough water for the entire Muslim world. Now, stop and think that through. There are 2 million people living in Mecca right now at any given time. 2 million people come into Mecca during the Hajj. So there is at least 4 million who are there. Then there are all these enormous millions and millions of bottles of Zamzam water that are shipped all over the world. You can go to any of your local Muslim markets or shops and you will see Zamzam water on the shelves. Millions and millions of liters of water. About 11 million liters of water are needed per day. And all of these liters, according to what the Muslims tell me, is that they go through the Zamzam well and come back out again, so that they can get forgiveness from Allah, and that Allah provides it. The difficulty is, as Mel says, this was a problem even for Queen Zubaydah. It became a huge problem for the Saudi Arabian government, and that's why they had to ask these large engineering firms. Interestingly, Bechtel was the major one, to create 27 different desalination plants along the western coast and on the eastern coast. But the western coast ones, the ones on the Red Sea, are desalinating the water for both Jeddah and for Mecca. When you look at, and I was going to show the pictures, you can look at the Zamzam well today. They've capped it, they put it underground, and they have pipes going into it and pipes coming out of it. And the pipes coming into it are coming from Jeddah. The pipes coming out of it are leaving and going to these enormous water tanks, the world's largest water tanks. We have pictures of them. I was going to show you them. And stored in those water tanks are not only the water for Zamzam, but also they purified, and they also put a little bit of sweetening into it. What's fascinating is this water does not come from Allah at all. It comes from Bechtel organization, and there are two others, another Canadian and another Spanish organization. So these are engineering firms that are Western. They have nothing to do with Allah. They don't even have anything to do with the Saudi Arabian government, other than the fact that the Saudi Arabian government paid for them to be installed. And so that's why this lie that the Zamzam well has always been there. There is no documentation for the Zamzam well prior to the 14th century. We don't know where the first documentation could have existed. Certainly, we don't know of any Zamzam references. We do have a possible reference in the 11th century. Some people say the Hadith talk about it. The difficulty with the Hadith is that Al-Bukhari, the first of the Hadith writers, the most important of the Hadith writer, the first volume we have of Al-Bukhari, it does not appear to the 11th century. The other 8 volumes don't appear to the 16th century. So we can't even trust that as being from the 9th or the 10th century. And this is the difficulty with many claims that Muslims are making. They're making the claims, but they don't support it historically. Back to you, Mel.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in the reason why they concocted the Zamzam well. It's because they're trying to imitate the Jewish people, because in the Jewish Targums, I'll just hold you up a book that's actually on one that I'm reading at the moment. You can see there, hopefully you can see it. It talks about the importance of the well for Jewish people, and the idea in Judaism among the rabbinical Jews is that you could prove that someone is a prophet from God if a well that's dry becomes bountiful with water. And they refer to people like Isaac and Jacob and Miriam in the Targum in relation to that. So it seems like that the Muslims are basically just copying the Jews and saying, oh, we've got a well to prove that our guy is magical. He's got the same powers as the people of old, So there's a bit of that to it.
I
The
want
other thing
to go on, Mel.
yeah, I was going to in a moment bring up the issue of Safa and Marwa, but I don't
I
know.
was going to say,
Question. This is a good question that Prof. Yafle is asking. Did the Qibla exist before Muhammad facing Jerusalem, according to Dan Gibson? If so, were there mosques before Muhammad? If so, what were they for? That's a great question, and we've got an answer to that. One of you two want to take it on?
It may not be the same answer as the others, but go ahead, Chris, if you want to go first. Or...
no, you go first on this one.
Okay,
if you want to.
I would argue that the Qiblas that existed prior to Mecca included, there was Jewish Qiblas, so the Jews prayed towards Jerusalem for a while. They also prayed to wherever the Exilarch existed, who was the Jewish leader. And also you have the Christians have their Qibla, because of course the Quran is talking both to the Christians and the Jews. So the Christians obviously pray to the east. So you have multiple Qiblas. So that would be my answer. But I don't think there was any Islam even
Okay, let me go
in
ahead
the
and
650s as well.
just so people know what we're talking about. We're talking about Dan Gibson's research. And I would highly recommend that you all get this book. This is it, Early Islamic Qiblas. It came out in 2017. Feel free, go ahead and get it. It's full of pictures. It's got lots of material. And he has really done a slap-up job of going personally himself to these mosques. And this is why, in some ways, he's so devastating. Unlike David King, who is considered the world authority on the Qiblas, who spent his whole career studying the Qiblas, but yet only went to one mosque personally, only physically went to one mosque. Gibson went to over 100 mosques, and he went physically to them. He took measurements for them. He took the most sophisticated measurements, like the Aster satellites that come out of Japan, which have been put up by Japan, which measure within a few yards of every object. And he was able then to look and see where the Qibla walls on over 100 mosques in many different countries, looking at the Qibla walls and then seeing where they were pointing. And what he noticed is that there was a multiplicity of different Qiblas. This is not new. David King knew this. This is something that he has in his own research. But David King, who is the world authority on this, always went back to 9th, 10th, and 11th century medieval scholars from Islam, and just quoted them without realizing that these 9th, 10th, 11th century medieval scholars never went to these mosques themselves, nor did they understand why these Qiblas were not directed towards Mecca. None of these Qiblas in the earliest centuries, 7th and 8th century, are directed towards Mecca. David King just quoted them without ever going to these mosques and trying to find out why they weren't facing Mecca. Gibson did just that. And he went from, I think it was from 1989 or 87 all the way up until 2004, went physically to all these Qiblas, went and measured them. And what he found is that they were all facing way too far north, about 600 miles too far north. Now, he suggests that the earliest ones, including these ones that you were talking about for the time that supposedly Muhammad would have been living, 626, 627, 632 when Muhammad finally died, 636, 668, and continuing up to 706. So now we're into the 8th century. About 17 of these Qiblas into the 8th century, from 626 up until 706, are all facing what he believed to be Petra. There has been some discussion as to whether some of them are Jerusalem, and that's why Mel is bringing in that also reference point. Obviously, these are not facing Mecca, and there's a reason they're not facing Mecca, because they were either Jewish Qiblas or Christian Qiblas, or they were Nabatean Qiblas. And the Nabateans' headquarters, the place of sanctuary, was Petra itself. That's why it stands to reason that these were temples. These were not mosques. They were taken over as mosques as Islam came into being. And certainly when you do find the first Qibla we find facing Mecca is a Qibla that is in Pakistan, in a place called Banbor. And it is dated to 727. Well, Muhammad died in 632. The Qibla was, according to the Quran, according to Islam, according to all the traditions, that the Qibla was canonized in 624. And that's why in the Quran, in chapter 2, verse 145 to 150, you have that movement of the Qibla from Jerusalem back down to the Masjid al-Haram, the forbidden place of bowing, which is fascinating because it doesn't say Mecca. It just says Masjid al-Haram. Where is this Masjid al-Haram? Well, until 727, that Masjid al-Haram was then designated as Mecca. Now, I'm not saying it started in 727. That's just the first evidence we have. But it looks like at the ending of the 7th century, the beginning of the 8th century, Mecca was chosen. And once Mecca was chosen by the Umayyads, later then became canonized by the Abbasids, who come to power in 749. From 749 on, then all the Qiblas start to then, that are being built, start to then focus towards Mecca. Now, there are still some handouts. There's still some hang-up people who refuse to be under the Abbasid rule, and their Qiblas are either one of 4 directions. And this is where Gibson has been helpful. Unlike King, who came before him, and unlike many other people who thought there were thousands of Qiblas and thousands of directions, he said, no, they're only in 4 directions. There are 4 Qiblas. The first one, and as I said, was the Petran Qibla. He calls it the Petran Qibla. Some people say some of them could have been Jerusalem as well, and I agree with that, and I think Mel, we're in agreement on that point. But that is up until 706, when a new Qibla was introduced, and that was what they called the between. And Qiblatain. Qiblatain means between. And the first mosque by Al-Hajjaj, when he built his mosque, he built a Qibla that looked like it was in between Petra and Mecca, almost exactly halfway. But there's nothing there. It's just sand dunes. There's no mountain. There's no building. There's no town. There's no edifice. There's nothing of any sort to support why there would be a Qibla there. And this looks like it's a political statement by Al-Hajjaj. He doesn't want to, because you have at that time, by the time he builds this Qibla in 706, the Abbasids are coming to power. They're getting stronger. The Umayyads are starting to get weaker. You have this political back and forth, and people were hedging their bets as to where that Qibla was going to, where they were going to build their Qibla. Was it going to be towards the Umayyad Qibla, which would have been Petra, or was it going to be towards the Abbasid Qibla, which would have now been Mecca? So he puts it in between, right smack down between the two buildings. And then about 11 other Qiblas that are built under his auspices, all in the Iraqi area, are in this in between. It's not till 727 that you get then the Meccan Qibla, which would be the Abbasid Qibla. The Abbasids are coming to power. They now have influence by 727. That influence is starting to grow and grow and grow. It will continue for another 20 years when finally they take over and bring the capital from Damascus and bring it down to Baghdad. Then after that, they make sure that all the Qiblas, but there's still some other holdouts, and they're way over in North Africa. North Africa, you have the mosques in North Africa, in Spain, who are looking straight south of North Africa, which doesn't make sense because it's not either Petra or Mecca. But when you put it up on a map, it's parallel to that line between Petra and Mecca. Now, this is what Gibson says. I'm not sure if I agree with him entirely, but I do assume that this is another political statement. Nonetheless, what is interesting is all the mosques in North Africa are facing south. A good 17 of the mosques from the earliest mosques are facing Petra. That's the 7th century mosque, every one of the 7th century mosques. And it's only really on 976 and on that all the mosques then begin to face Mecca. So it's much, much too late. That's about 200 years too late. And that's why we're saying, isn't it interesting that the Qibla, along with what we're finding out about the traditions, Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, they're all coming from the Abbasid era. They're all coming from further north. And they all seem to have the same narrative. And that's why Mecca came into importance. That's why Mecca was so, suddenly it was Mecca that became the center of the world, became the center of history. And that's why this narrative that Adam and Eve were there, that Abraham was there. In fact, don't stop there. There's about 70 to 300 prophets that have been named that were buried in Mecca. Now remember, you're buried in the place you die, and you're buried within 24 hours. So if these people were buried there, prophet after prophet after prophet, I mean, there's a whole litany that we can go through, a whole list of them. Daniel, the Queen of Sheba, you have Ishmael, you have Abraham. They're all buried there. Adam and Eve, they're all buried there. And it's interesting, if they're all buried there, it says in the traditions that they're buried in a praying position. That means they're actually praying as they're buried. So because their bodies do not deteriorate. Fascinating when you stop and think of that. I'm not going to get into the ramifications of that, but you can see we can spin off from that later on.
That is huge.
The Qibla is a huge problem. And Dan Gibson has taken an awful lot of hatred for this. He's taken an awful lot of flack. Dr. David King has just gone on to a vitriolic roll against it. and has called them all kinds of names. What's fascinating is David King. I can understand why he's angry. I can understand his whole career is kind of being thrown into topsy-turvy because of Gibson's finding. But you have to go with where the evidence takes you. And Gibson went with the evidence on the ground. We have to go with the evidence on the ground. And something we have said, I say it to my students, I say it to everybody, if you're going to have a discussion, please, for heaven's sakes, go to the 7th century, look at the 7th century, find out what is happening in the 7th century, and then come back to me and talk about the 7th century. Then we have a discussion. Don't keep mocking or mimicking and just reiterating what the 9th and 10th century compilers said. And these were just compilers. That's all they were. These are nothing more than people who compiled what they had found before and given to them, and they threw out what they didn't like and only retained what they did. They're 9th and 10th century. They're way too late, hundreds of years too late, and hundreds of miles too far north. Stick to the 7th century. That's what Gibson did. And that's why his material is so difficult to refute.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on there. I actually want to just sort of derive something from what you said. The fact that these Qiblas seem to be evolving over a period of time, there doesn't seem to be an agreed upon date. It seems to be changing, and it seems to be changing in response to a political landscape that's not even in the area of the Hijaz. It's 600, however many miles further north. So what we're seeing here is something that is not in the same place, that is coming at a later time, and that is completely political in nature. And this actually comes back to the theological implications of this, because this is a core theological belief. You know, the Kaaba is the very essence of Islam, the very basic claims that are made about Islam, like you were saying earlier, Jay. And I think this changes everything. And I think if you can show that this is something that has political ramifications, you can show, it's not grounded in truth, it's grounded in politics.
Yeah, I would just add something there, that if we look at the Jewish side of things, which I think is important because the Muslims are clearly copying many of the practices and beliefs of the Jews back then. The Jews followed they changed their Qibla according to wherever the exilarch lived and was resident. So they were used to a fluid Qibla, and it seems like the Muslims are imitating that. The Jews believed that the Shekinah, which is the spirit of God, was wherever their religious leader was. And so it could be, that the Qibla evidence is pointing to something like that. The other point I wanted to make is that Al-Azraqi, writing in 865, mentions that Caliph al-Mansur was developing Mecca in the 750s, which I think kind of goes along with everything else that we've been saying, that it's really a development. So if you think about 750s up to the time of Queen Zubaydah, who's now needs to get water, you can see like a trajectory where you have like a building site essentially in the 750s heading towards something more substantial by the end of the century. But look at the dates, that's like 150, 160 years after the time it should have been all developed. It should have been a long established pilgrimage site by that stage if the standard Islamic narrative was correct.
Here's a good question by Brown Warrior. Do you think they have simply moved the spring of Jerusalem and reappropriated it to Mecca?
So I wanted to ask real quickly.
That's the whole Jerusalem thesis, isn't it?
Yeah.
Go on, yeah.
I think that would fit in nicely because there is actually water channels that run right under the Temple Mount, and you have the Pool of Siloam, which is down, I believe it's the southern end of the Temple Mount. And that was, of course, famous for where people went to get healing. Jesus famously healed people in that pool. So I can imagine how that could easily be appropriated, let's say, to Mecca.
But this opens up the whole Jerusalem thesis, and it would be since that's a good question that Brown's bringing up. Let's go ahead and answer that. I don't know, Chris. Why don't you, Chris and Mel? Why don't you go ahead and start it, and I'll end it if there needs to be added to it.
Could you share my slides, Chris? Sorry to put across you.
Will do. There we go.
This is very much on the button. So I think a good way of looking at it is if we consider the tradition about Marwa and Safa, where pilgrims who go to Mecca run back and forth on a horizontal site between two boulders, not even hills, not even mountains. If we query where there was a historical Marwa and Safa, those are what the boulders look like today. But if we go to the historical evidence, we can see that this is Jerusalem. Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple Mount is built, that's it in Hebrew, essentially, Moriah, but in Arabic, you would pronounce it Marwa. Mount Scopus, well, that's Mount Safa, and this is mentioned by Josephus as Safa way back 2,000 years ago. So we have a historical precedent for Safa and Marwa, but it's not connected to Mecca. We have it connected to Jerusalem, and I think this is another smoking gun which points to the idea of things from the north being taken down south. So we mentioned about 300 prophets who are actually buried in Israel and those environments. Suddenly the Muslim claim is, no, we have those and they're buried down in Mecca. It's kind of like people who are going abroad and they're bringing back souvenirs. Oh, I'd like a bit of Safa and Marwa. Let's build our own one in our neck of the woods. Do a little miniature version of it. But the original Safa and Marwa have actually proper hills. They're on top of decent hills in Jerusalem. You have the Valley of Decision, which is there. And even Muslims today, they believe that this valley is of huge significance. This is where Gog and Magog will return or will meet. This is meant to be the place of the apocalypse. And also, if we go on to the next slide, and we look at, those are those two places I've just mentioned. But if you look at this valley, which is connected to it, the valley called Jananim or Janin in Jerusalem is mentioned 101 times in the Quran. That's a lot of mentions of a place that's in the Quran. Now, the argument that is made by Muslims is, oh, well, that's a metaphorical thing. This is, it doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the geography. Well, that's fair enough, but it's still pointing to the importance of a location in Jerusalem, whether you take it literally or metaphorically or theologically. That's where they're drawing their inspiration from, and this is where I would suggest that they're imitating. Just hand it back to you, Chris or Jay.
Go back 2 slides. Go back to the picture of Marwa and Safa, if you could, in Mecca.
This one?
Go beyond, further back.
Oh yeah, this one. Yeah.
Stop right there. Go 1 slide back further, and I want to show people. Can you see Marwa and Safa there? Maybe, Chris, if you can take away the question.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, look and see those. You can see Marwa and Safa. Mel has made a red circle around it. Look at the Kaaba right to it. Notice how close the Kaaba is to Marwa and Safa. About halfway between Marwa and Safa is the Zamzam well. You can't see it here because it's now underground, but it's about halfway between those 2 mountains. Now remember, these are mountains according to Islamic tradition. And you ask any Muslim, what are they doing? Why are they running back and forth between these 2 mountains, Marwa and Safa? They're commemorating when Hagar was thrown out of Mecca. She was thrown out by Abraham, takes Ishmael with her. She's thrown out into the desert, and so she runs out of water, and so she's looking for water. So these are the 2 mountains. These are the 2 mountains, Marwa and Safa, that she's looking for. So that's why they run back and forth 7 times between these 2 mountains, Marwa and Safa. She goes to Marwa, can't find water, then she returns to Safa, can't find water, then returns to Marwa, can't find mountains. Now go to the next slide, Mel. Take a look at what these mountains look like. Notice see all the people there? Notice how small these mountains are? These are nothing more than rocks. They're just about 20 feet high. Rocks do not make a mountain. So it's obviously this is not the original Marwa and Safa. Go back to the slide before that again. The one you were just showing.
This one?
That
one or forward?
How close they are. Now, people, this is what I've asked Muslims to stop and think. If this is where Hagar is looking for water, and that's why these 2 mountains are there, then how in the world could she be out in the desert? If she's out in the desert all by herself, and there's no water anywhere, and she's going between two mountains, then what are they doing just a few hundred yards away from the Kaaba? Because the Kaaba is the center of Mecca. There are hundreds, according to the Islamic tradition, there are thousands of people living in Mecca. Abraham is living in Mecca. If she had run out of water, she just need to go one of their doors and knock on the door. Obviously, this is not the Marwa and Safa that Hagar went to. This is nothing more than a facsimile, a stylized facsimile, much like you have if you were to go to Las Vegas today, you will see an Eiffel Tower there. You will see a pyramid there. That's not the original Eiffel Tower. That's not the original pyramid. Those are nothing more than facsimiles of the original ones that are in Paris and in Cairo. So that's what's going on here. Well, if this is nothing more than a facsimile, where's the original? Those cannot be the original. In the same token, neither can Zamzam well be the original. These are nothing more than representations of an original, and that's why Mel, if you go back to Josephus, the word in Arabic for Moriah, Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple Mount was. You can see Mount Moriah there. In the Arabic reference, the Arabic spelling for Moriah is Marwa. As Josephus tells us in the 1st century, the Arabic spelling for Mount Scopus is Safa. So that's the original Mount Moriah, that's the original Mount Scopus, that's the original Safa and Marwa. From where these Jews took it when, of course, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. They took these ideas with them. They took these the same type of what's the word I'm looking for? The same type of what you're doing when you're doing a pilgrimage, the same type of actions that they were doing in the pilgrimage, they took them with them. Gibson goes and shows where these were also reproduced in Petra. If they were reproduced in Petra after 70 AD, why are we surprised that they were then reproduced again in Mecca sometime in the 8th century? So that would possibly be the reason they originally were in Jerusalem. They're now been taken down to Mecca. Go ahead, Mel.
Just a point on Scopus and Safa. So Scopus is the Greek version of the name, and Safa, I believe, is either the Hebrew or the Aramaic. I can't remember which, but it couldn't be more connected to Judaism, the actual name Safa. So Scopus is just the Greek version of the name. And the reason why we call it Scopus rather than Safa is because of the Byzantines being there and so forth, for quite a while.
And for those who don't know, Hebrew and Arabic have the same root, so it'd be the same root.
Yeah.
In the same race, in the same token, when you look at the Kaaba, Kaaba in Arabic is the same in Hebrew. It means square. It means cube. And when you go back to the Josephus's writings, and you go back to the 1st century, before the temple was destroyed, the Holy of Holies was the Kaaba, was the cube. So the same idea of the cube being in Jerusalem, and the circumambulation 7 times was there in Jerusalem, and that had been reproduced now to Mecca. So you have a new Kaaba now. They're circumambulating 7 times. Why 7? Ask a Muslim. Why the number 7? It makes no sense in Islam. The 7 is a Hebrew declension because that's where in Jericho God had the Israelites go around 7 times around Jericho, going counterclockwise, the same direction. So that's why all of this really, when you come about it, there you go. You're going to bring that up there so they can see that.
Let me just see where. I think it's one of these slides, I believe.
Now, of course, where the Kaaba is.
There we are.
Where the Kaaba in Jerusalem is today would be the Dome of the Rock. That was built in 691 by Abd al-Malik. He then puts it right there where the original Kaaba was, where the original temple was, where the original Holy of Holies was. And there's an awful lot we can get into the Dome of the Rock, but let's stick to Mecca for now.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I think is worth pointing out is Abd al-Malik's right-hand man was called Al-Hajjaj. Now, Al-Hajjaj is actually the same way that some Arabs pronounce, let me put it a different way. Hagag is the Jewish version of that, and it's still pronounced that way, Hagag, in some Arab countries, such as Egypt. Now, what does Hagag actually mean? So just remember, Abd al-Malik, his right-hand man is called Al-Hajjaj. It actually means, in Hebrew, it means a pilgrim to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's another little indicator that everything doesn't add up. Why is Abdul Malik's closest person nicknamed a person who goes to pilgrimage in Jerusalem? Why isn't he called something like a person who goes on pilgrimage to Mecca? If standard Islamic narrative is correct, that to me is very suspect, you know. So there's a lot of holes in the narrative.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because the way I'm seeing this is we have these competing stories in effect. We have Sawa, Mawa, and we have the Tawif circumambulation around the Kaaba, and we can trace these back to an older and much more historically supported narrative in Jerusalem and in Israel. If we can do this for multiple different aspects, sometimes just completely like in a superior way, like with Safa Mawa, the mountains that are supposedly by the Kaaba are tiny. They're definitely not real mountains. They're just collections of rocks, basically. Whereas we can actually find real mountains in Jerusalem. That sounds to me as if there's no way you could argue this wasn't just direct borrowing from pre-existing sources, like especially with the etymology of the words, right? If you can trace the words back because they have a common root, then yeah, it seems unescapable.
Now, there's another question that's come up about from Dewey Bulan Anakdewa. Did they find Adam's bones yet in Mecca? In your PowerPoint, do you have a picture of what's happening in Mecca right now?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, I have it in mind, but I can't get my PowerPoint up, so I will not be able to do that. I'm not very well versed with StreamYard in YouTube. I could slap it up and show you. But if anybody would just Google a picture of Mecca today, and take a look at all the building that's going on in Mecca today. I don't know if you can bring a current picture up, Chris, but there are enormous buildings being built. There is the fourth highest building in the world, this huge clock tower that just towers over the Kaaba. It's right there next to the Kaaba. Around it are other huge buildings, enormous skyscrapers. They're going to build anywhere from 62 to 66 skyscrapers around the Kaaba in Mecca in the next few decades. Now, when you build buildings like that, huge buildings, you have to dig enormous foundations. You have to dig down into the ground. And whenever you dig foundations, the archaeologists show up. Of course they do. Look at any archaic building. I mean, we lived in London for 25 years. Mel, you used to come there. Chris, you're down in London often. When you go to London and you can see the Roman ruins that are there. Every time you dig down in there, you're going to come across ruins. You're going to come across artifacts. And that's why the archaeologists like it, because they don't have the means to dig that deep down. And in every archaic city, you will find you can recreate the history of the city just by looking at these artifacts. Well, the same must also hold for Mecca. If there are all these enormous these prophets like Adam and Eve and Seth and Ishmael and Noah and Hud and Saleh and Queen of Sheba and Daniel, up to 300 of these prophets buried there that we have listed in the traditions. With all this digging that's going on, they should at least come across one of these prophets. They haven't found one. Dan Gibson talks about this. He mentions there, you can see there's a picture of the clock tower. You can see the other large buildings all around it. Every one of them are skyscrapers. There's many more. Look down the bottom right. Look at all the cranes there. That's the enormous buildings that are happening at the moment. So all this, whenever you build like this, you're going to be digging into the ground. You're going to be digging out artifacts, you would hope. He was at a conference, I think it was in Dubai. I'm not sure which city it was. There were some Saudi Arabian archaeologists who were there as well. And he sat with them. Of course, he speaks Arabic. And so he asked them, well, with all this building going on, you must be finding all kinds of artifacts. This is the oldest city in history. This is a city where Adam and Eve went. You must be finding artifacts that go right back to 1900 BC when Abraham lived there. Certainly, you must coming across something. And they didn't want to respond to him at first, he said. And finally, they said, well, the earliest thing that we have been able to find is ruins of an old Ottoman fort from 1299 AD. That's the late 13th century AD, folks. You're talking about 600 years after Muhammad, if Muhammad had existed, is the earliest artifacts on a large scale that they have been able to find in Mecca, suggesting very clearly that architecturally and archaeologically, Mecca is not a very old city, and certainly is not older than Jerusalem. It looks like Jerusalem has lots of references. You can go to any place in Jerusalem and look at the archaeology there, and just enormous amount of artifact after artifact after artifact that supports all the way back to the 19th century BC. We can find artifacts in Jerusalem that support the historical account. And what's fascinating, they support the biblical account of who Jesus was, even the fact that there was a person named Jesus. We can go to not just the archaeological, but we can also go to many of the historical accounts. Josephus, we can go to Tacitus, we can go to Thallus, we can go to Phlegon. These Thallus and Phlegon, who are debating the event of the crucifixion, and mentioned that on the day Jesus died, the earth shook and the sun went dark. And this is a debate that was happening in 52 AD. That's just 20 years after Christ's death. Tacitus, who is referring to not only the fact that he hated Christians, he had nothing good to say about it, but he did talk about Jesus. He did refer that Jesus died during the time of Pontius Pilate under the authority of Tiberius. That's why we know it's at 33 AD, because of Tacitus. He was certainly a hostile witness. You have Josephus, who is writing in Rome, and he talks about the fact that there he refers to Jesus by name. He talks about the crucifixion. He even refers to Jesus' brother James and refers to his death. So certainly the historicity that we have demanded of our New Testament and of our Jerusalem and of our man Jesus and of our the scriptures itself, when we ask the same questions of both the Quran and Muhammad and now Mecca, what we're doing today, we just don't have these kind of answers. We just don't have this kind of support. And that's why Muslims, if you're listening to this, you've got to find support for your city. You've got to find support for your prophet, and you've got to find support for your holy book, the Quran.
So, just to ask and follow on this, what do Muslims have an early reference for Mecca? When's the earliest reference we have from a source that explicitly references Mecca?
It's 741. It's called a Byzantium Arabica, and it was first unearthed by Patricia Corona back in 1977 in her book Hagerism. She then repeated it in her book 1987 on Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. For those two books that she wrote, she got death threats because she was writing them as the head of department at Oxford University. This Arabica, Byzantia, which is fascinating because she even took the quote, the first reference, the quote that she has in that book, dated to 741, yet it puts Mecca at the wrong place. It puts Mecca way up into southern Turkey, which is not where Mecca is today. So it's obviously not the same Mecca, but it certainly became a forerunner to the Mecca that was then chosen in the south. I don't know if you want to say anything more on that, Mel.
I think it's interesting. It's one of the stations of Abraham. So maybe there was a confusion that they had an idea of Mecca as being one of the stations of Abraham, because Ur would have been one of the stations, Haran would have been one, and also Jerusalem. So it could be that there's some confusion, and maybe there's a lots of alternative myths going around at that time, and they heard one version of the myths before it got focused on Mecca, you know.
And of course, they thought that that's where Abraham was buried. Up until the last century, everybody thought that Abraham was buried up there in Paran, just south of Edessa, where the Mecca would have been. So that makes a lot of sense. And interestingly, since they have now discovered, J.E. Taylor was one that discovered this. I think he discovered it in 1853. So coming up to 200 years ago, that has now been changed. We now know that Abraham was from Ur, and Ur was not up in Paran. Ur was down in what is southern Turkey today. I'm sorry, southern Iraq today.
I think he was saying the opposite. I think I thought the traditions were, and maybe I've got it wrong. No, you're right. Sorry, I got it the wrong way around in my head.
Until 1853, everybody thought it was up in Paran. He was the one that said no, and then you had Woolley, Sir Leonard Woolley, who's the one that really uncovered Ur and proved to the point that this is the original Ur where Abraham lived in southern Iraq.
Yeah.
Just to jump in, I know there's some people in the comments that seem to be challenging what we're saying here. If any of you would like to come on and join and debate live, we're more than happy to have you do that. I can send you a link. If you just want to say yes, I want to debate in the chat, just post that, and I'll know who it is, and I'll invite you on. Because it does seem like we've been going for about an hour now. We've got 237 people watching us live, and we seem to have attracted some people that don't quite agree what we're saying. So let's see if they have the confidence to defend what they're saying. In the meantime, though, I guess a real kind of like basic point, but I think it's worth mentioning is if we don't have a Mecca, if we can't establish the historical basis for a Mecca, what does that actually mean practically? Like, does that have any knock-on effects for other things that Islam holds dear?
Well, that's the problem right there. In fact, in the course that I'm teaching right now, where I go through the book, The Man and the Place, I call it the book, the Quran, Man, Muhammad, and the Place, Mecca. We start with Mecca, and the reason why, if you don't have Mecca, think of Islam as a stool with three legs. The book, The Man and the Place, are the three legs that hold up. With those three legs, Islam is absolutely dependent on. You take out one of those legs, and the other two come crashing down. And the leg that we start with is Mecca, because once you confront Mecca and show that there was no Mecca in the 7th century, in the 8th and 9th, yes, but not in the 7th or before, that shuts down any notion that there could be a man named Muhammad who was born there, who lived there and spent the first 60 years there. That shuts down any notion that there could be a Quran from there. And that then it makes it much easier than to say, well, there must be a Muhammad. We don't doubt that there was someone named Muhammad, but it's not the Muhammad of Mecca. He did not come from Mecca. The Muhammad that we are finding, and if you look at all the traditions on Muhammad, all the references to him in the 7th century, he's way up north. He's up in Jerusalem. He's coming from what is today Iraq and Jordan, that area in Syria. He is not at all. There is no person named Muhammad. And that when you look at the Quran, look at all the manuscripts, look at even the Arabic that's in the Quran. Take a look at the Arabic in the Quran. It is Nabatean Aramaic Arabic. It is not Sabaic Arabic. And the Sabaic Arabic is what they would have used if whoever wrote the Quran had written it in Mecca or Medina, the two places the Quran was supposedly written. Sabaic Arabic is from way down in Yemen, in the south part of Arabia. The Arabic that would have been used in the central part would have reflected that Arabic. Yet look at the Arabic that you see, the Tar Marbuta, the Alif Maksura, the definite article. All of those are Nabatean Aramaic. They are right through the Quran, right through the Arabic that is there, which means they had to have been written up in what is today Jordan and Syria. Not any further. Look at all the theological discussions that were happening in the Quran. The Quran is full of theological discussions, and it's all discussions with Jews and Christians. There were no Jews and Christians living that far south. Robert Hoyland made that point really clear in 1997. There were no Jews that lived further south than Tabuk or at the most Medina Saleh. Nothing down that far south, because there's no reason for Jews and Christians to live that far south. There's nothing there for them to live down there. The only people that would ever live there were Bedouins, and these were Arab Bedouins, and these were mostly people who saw their lineage from Ishmael. But certainly the Jews and Christians who were having these enormous debates, these fascinating debates that you see right through the Quran, the whole debate of the Trinitarian versus the Anti-Trinitarian debate that's going on right through the Quran. That only could have happened up in the north, because that's where that was happening. That was where that was going on. It could only happen around places like Damascus and places like Petra and Jerusalem and places like what was Ctesiphon, which later became Baghdad. That's where it makes sense. But that's where the water is. That's where the vegetation is. That's where the people are. No wonder that's where both the Quran and Muhammad, if there is a Muhammad, I still don't know if we know who this Muhammad was, if he ever existed. They would have had to live that further north. Why? Because we've shut down Mecca.
I would add, in terms of the implications of it, if you were to look at any of the hadiths, the Sirah, if you look at the amount of dependence on the geography for all of their stories, if you take the character of Aisha and her relationship with Muhammad, there's references to Mecca and Medina and so forth. It's all about the geography. Once you throw out the geography, if the geography is bogus, then everything else is just a house of cards that come tumbling down. And if you throw out Aisha, it means that there's the majority of the Hadiths are thrown out. Not that we put much credence on the Hadiths to begin with, but it has a massive impact on the whole story. What are you left if you take out Mecca? What are you left in terms of all those stories? Not a lot. You can also refer to the fact that where we do find a reference to the Tayyaye of Muhammad, which is what Thomas the Presbyter writing in about 640 AD. Where does he locate him? He locates him, I think it was something like 14 miles east of Gaza. What's he doing up there? Why does he not have the Quraysh as his tribe? Why does he have an Iraqi tribe? Because the Tayyaye existed up in Iraq. So you have lots of these geographical problems. It's not just Mecca itself is the issue.
Well, let me take on this question here by David Bond. It's a good question. He's saying this is only a hypothesis of revisionists, but not historical facts. The text of the Birmingham manuscript discovered in Yemen is evidence Islam was in Mecca and Medina. Okay, David, let's take that one on. Have you looked at first of all, David, are you even aware of what's in that Birmingham folio? There is no manuscript called the Birmingham manuscript. It's not a complete Quran. It's only 33 verses, 2 sides of 2 folios. Look and see. In fact, I'm going to bring it up so I have it in front of me so I don't misquote it. Go ahead and jump into it, and I'll just bring it up before I...
One thing I will say, David, if you want to come on and join us live, just let me know and I'll invite you on. Otherwise, we're going to address your comments here because you made what I would consider to be a completely wrong and inaccurate representation of what we're doing here. I think this is completely historical. I think everything that Jay and Mel has brought in particular has been an historical approach. This isn't hypothesis anymore. This is historical evidence that leads to a probabilistic outcome, which is that Mecca simply cannot be the city that it claims to, that Islam claims it was back at the time of Muhammad or before then.
Okay, I want to just bring up this one here. And when you look at the Birmingham folio, I wish I could put it in front of you. You could see it. It's front and back of 2 folios, two pieces of paper. Most scholars today believe that these 2 folios that were found in Birmingham in another manuscript belong to the Petropolitanus manuscript. The Petropolitanus, in fact, I've got the Petropolitanus right here in my studio, in my office here. It is only 33 verses. What's interesting, it is reference to 3 different surahs in the Quran. Surah 18 verses 17 to 31, Surah 19 verses 91 to 98, and Surah 20 verses 1 to 40. Look at those 3 sets of verses, David. These only make up 33 verses. There are 6,236 verses in the entire Quran. But even with just those 3 surahs from which it's been lifted out of, those 3 surahs only make up 343 verses. So this is just 10% of the 3 surahs that they are taken from. What's fascinating, when you look at Surah 18, it's a story of the 7 sleepers. The story of the 7 sleepers comes from the Syrian bishop Jacob of Sarug, which was written in 512. So that predates the Quran, predates Islam, predates Muhammad. Surah 19 verses 91 to 98 is from the Proto-Evangelium of James, which comes from 145 AD. That predates Islam or the Quran by a good 500 years. And then Surah 20 verses 1 to 40 is the story of Moses that comes straight out of the Bible. Well, that comes from 1400 BC. So you can see there's a problem because every one of these 3 stories that are in these folios have nothing to do with Islam. They are all pre-Islamic. They are all well-known. These are well-known documents, which were written in Arabic, but notice there are no diacritical marks on this. So there's only 14 letters there. When you look at the 14 letters, it's not impossible, but it's very hard to read. So this predates when the dots and the vowels were added. Those dots and vowels were added in the 8th and 9th century. But I'm not going to get into that so much as looking at these 3 stories. If they are predating, then you stop and ask yourself, well, where did they come from, David? Well, obviously, they came from Arabic sources that had got it from another source. And when you look at the other source, you can see these are mostly Aramaic sources. These are Hebrew sources. These were well known. They were well existed. They were then taken out of those sources and brought into Arabic sometime in the 7th and 8th century. More than likely, these 2 folios, according to the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is dated to around 705 to 720, are an 8th century manuscript. This is not from the 7th century. Now, you might say that the carbon dating says that they are from 568 to 645. I'm willing to go with you on that. I would like to say that's probably so. But remember, carbon dating is just dating the parchment itself. It's not dating the ink. You can only date the parchment. So that's the day that the animal from which the parchment was made, because these are made out of animal skins, mostly out of goat skins or deer skin. So these are the dates for the animal when it died. So you're only looking at the parchment. You're not looking when it's written. But that still would bother me, because let's just say this is from the time of Muhammad. Let's say this part, these 3 stories on these 2 chapters, from these 3 chapters were written. Where's the rest of the surahs? Where's the more important surahs that have to deal with Islam itself? Why is there nothing Islamic in any of these 3 stories? That suggests to me these have been borrowed. As much of the Quran is borrowed from other sources. Go back to you, Mel.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's very likely that they wouldn't have made fresh parchment for this. They probably would have raided the monasteries and just scraped off what was there and put on their own text, because these would have been really expensive to make. But the other thing is the fact that these verses are jumping massively from one surah to the other. How can this be part of a Quran? Why is there large parts of the Quran missing from one section to the other? So this perhaps is an attempt to put together a Quran, but that is actually even worse for Islam. This could be evidence that they're trying to doctor a document together rather than it being evidence of an early Quran.
I absolutely agree with that, Mel. I would just like to add a few things here. I actually think this is devastating for the traditional, the standard Islamic narrative. So if we look at the dating for this, I believe which is 568 to 645, well, now we've just entered into the possible realm of this could have predated Muhammad even existing, right? So Muhammad was born in 570, so this could be in the range 2 years before that. But even if we ignore this, we now need to think, well, he had revelation in 610, right, in the Hira cave. So that means that this is now you have about 40 years leeway, where if this predated that, that means that, yeah, this is something before Muhammad even had revelation. In other words, this completely discounts the entire Islamic narrative at its very root. Muhammad never had this as revelation. And this is the question that you've now put on the table because of this dating. And something else is, if we accept this as an authentic Uthmanic manuscript from an Uthmanic Quran, doesn't this predate the Uthmanic recension? Wasn't the Uthmanic recension in 652? Or potentially 652 to 656? If it was, that means that the entire basis for how the Quran was collaborated and put together into one Qurayshi dialect was false. That never happened. So either way, you're committing yourself to a very dangerous position, because either you found something that has stories in it that predate the Quran by hundreds of years, so possibly this is just demonstrating that the Quran borrowed material, or you've demonstrated that this happened before Muhammad was either born or before he had revelation in 610, or you've demonstrated this isn't an Uthmanic, this is an Uthmanic Quran, and therefore the entire narrative about Uthman was wrong. Either way, you've just caused serious damage to the standard Islamic narrative.
Let's go one step further. He makes a claim that because the Birmingham Folio are from the time of Muhammad, therefore Islam existed by the time in Mecca and Medina. There's nothing about this Quran that's from Mecca and Medina. So where did he come to that conclusion? How does someone come to that conclusion? But let's go to the S.I.N manuscript, which is a much older manuscript than this. The S.I.N manuscript is the oldest. It's dated to 705. They did carbon dating. Let's go back to this carbon dating problem. They did carbon dating on the S.I.N manuscript in four different laboratories. One in Kiel, which is in Germany, one in Zurich, which is in Switzerland, one in Lyon, which is in France, and then the same laboratory that they did the Birmingham Folio, the Oxford laboratory. They dated the same parchment, the same manuscript, or parchment, sorry, from the manuscript, which is much larger than these folios, to those four labs, and look at the dates they got. The carbon dates they got ranged anywhere from 390 up to 550. 390 AD up to 550. That means in all four laboratories for the S.I.N manuscript, which is a older manuscript, were all predate Islam, all predate the Quran, and all predate Muhammad. So are you going to therefore say that actually, which is a much larger manuscript than these two folios, are you going to say that all this came predate before Islam? Can you understand the corner you're putting yourself into by making these kind of jumps? Don't do that. Make sure that you follow the science, and make sure also that your conclusions follows the science. You can't conclude from what he said here, David. Come back to us on it and see what. I'd love to see how you'd rebut what we just told you.
I've been looking at the comments. I haven't seen anything from David that came back to us about this. I don't think if anyone notices a reply, point it out to me in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to say that he simply doesn't have a response to this, which I think is probably the most likely case.
Chris, we are getting off the topic, and
yeah, let's get back onto this.
A whole thing just on the Quran itself. That might be something that the three of us can do at a later date.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get back onto what we were talking about regarding Mecca. So one thing that we always think about is when there are these cities that we want to have historical evidence about, we have references to them. And often different places talk about others. So you might see like Antioch might make reference to Jerusalem, or vice versa, or Cairo might make reference to somewhere else. Is there any major city that references Mecca anywhere around, or are there any major cities that have historical evidence that show that they exist at the time of Mecca?
Well, I wish I could put my PowerPoint up for this one.
Yeah, I couldn't find any.
And then I'll continue. You go and start, Mel.
Yeah, it's funny that you can pretty much pick any place in Israel, Iraq, Syria, and you'll find plenty of historical records to back up those places' existence going back 2,000-3,000 years. You can find clay tablets, for example, in Syria to prove the existence of different kingdoms and cities and so forth, and actually hear the tales from those places. You find nothing to do with Mecca. There's no references. So it's probably the best hidden city in history if it existed pre-7th century, but I don't see how it's even remotely credible. Islam has had hundreds of years to gather the evidence to prove it, and we have got not a single piece of evidence for Mecca.
This is a question that Koren asked. This is a question that Patricia Crone asked. This is a question that Michael Cook asked back in the last century. And they said, what is it? What did the people surrounding the Hijaz? The Hijaz is that central part of Arabia where Mecca and Medina exist. What did the people who surrounded? So they went, and Patricia Crone did a great thing. She went to the Sabaeans who were down the south, asked them, just look. Now remember, Patricia Crone is unique in the world in that she reads and writes 15 languages, archaic languages. So she goes back to the original documentation. This is something Muslims should have done. No Muslim has done this. So she did it herself, being a linguist. And she went back to the Sabaean documents there in southern, what is today Yemen. She went to the Himyar documents, which are further over to the east in Oman. She went to the Azdi documents, which are in the Straits of Hormuz. And then she went to Kinda, Du Kahilun documents, which are in what is today where Riyadh would be, so the eastern part of the country. And she looked and went through all their documentation, couldn't find any reference at all to this city called Mecca, which is fascinating because if you look on a map, that they're very close to Mecca. But then she went further up. She went to the Qadarites. She went to three different cities, Duma, Taima, and Dedan, which are straight north of Mecca, and asked if they had any reference. No reference whatsoever to the city of Mecca. So then she went to the larger empires. She went to the Persian Empire in the east. She went to the Babylonians in what is today Iraq. She went to the Assyrians also in what is today Iraq. And then she went to the Roman Empire, which is further west. And she went and looked to all their documents. Now, she could read the original documents, and she started the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, up into the 8th century, including trading documents. And by this, she went down to the Nubians and the Aksum and the Abyssinians in what is today Eritrea or Sudan and Egypt, so along the western coast of the Red Sea. Went across all those trading documents. She went all as far as India, the western coast of India, because that's where the trade would have come from, and wanted to ask and see whether any of these civilizations, any of these peoples, any of these documents that she was reading, original documents, referred to this place, Mecca. Not one reference at all. But then she says, well, hold on a minute. Let's look at the other cities that are surrounding Mecca, the ones that are So she went and she said, well, do these documents talk about Maghrib, which is where the dam was in Yemen, or Sana'a, which we know Sana'a is the capital of what is today Yemen, the Najran, which is just straight north of Sana'a. She found references on all these documents to Maghrib, to Sana'a, to Najran. She found references to Taif, which is just southeast of where is today Mecca, up about 3,000 feet up on the plateau. She found references to Yathrib. She found references to Khaybar and Petra and Mamre. All these cities that are along what we know as the Western Plateau. She found reference after reference in these documentations, but no reference to Mecca. And that's why she wrote her book, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, in 1987. Why is it this greatest city in the history of mankind? It's where Adam and Eve were living. It's where they died. It's where Abraham rebuilt the Kaaba. If this is the city which was the center of trade. And remember, these cities that I'm talking about, Sana'a, Najran, Taif, Yathrib, Khaybar, up to Tabuk, Petra, and Mamre. This is along the trade route, the local trade route, not the international trade route. She went and found that all these are referred to, but nothing about Mecca. And then she looked at the map and she said the reason why is very simple. Look at a map. Just look at a map and see where Mecca is located. It's not on the Western Plateau. It's off the Western Plateau, a good 3,000 feet down. Therefore, there would be no reason for it to be mentioned because no trade would have gone through there. And here's where she shut down the William Montgomery Watt's trade route theory that I have grown up with, that all of us have taught. When I studied Islam way back in the 1980s and the 1990s, we all learned about the trade route theory. This is what made Mecca important. This is what created the importance of Mecca, because the trade route that had gone up through the Persian Gulf, from India across the Arabian Sea up to the Persian Gulf, all the way up to what is today, what is that city that's right there? Basra, and then across Iraq, across Syria, over into the Mediterranean world, Petra, and then on Gaza and on to the west. That trade route was shut down because of the great wars between the Sassanians and the Byzantines from the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, and they had to redirect the trade down to Aden, and from Aden went to Aden to Sana'a, to Najran, to Taif, to Yathrib, to Khaybar, then on up to Petra, and then on up to Gaza. That's what he came up with, and that opened up a whole new way of thinking for all of us. All of us thought, oh, so that's why Mecca was part of the trade route, because it controlled that trade from Aden up to Gaza. Patricia Crone says, no, just look at a map. You can see there's no such thing. It's not on the trade route because that trade route is too far up. Why would you go from Taif, come down to 3,000 feet to a place that had no water, no food, there was no history there, then go back up 3,000 feet to get back up to Yathrib before you headed on your trade? It would be stupid, unless, of course, there's something more that's there. And that, of course, maybe because there's a sanctuary there. So she went and looked at all the sanctuaries. There is no reference to any sanctuary anywhere. Oh, there is a reference to one way up in the Gulf of Aqaba, but that's 960 miles away. There's one over on the east, which is Dabanagiris, but that's on the other side of the continent. All these references, she couldn't find anything. And then she didn't go far enough, obviously, because she didn't ask, well, what about the Red Sea trade route? Because that is a question that many Muslims come up with. They didn't go through Mecca on the land. They went through Mecca on the sea. They came up to Ajalis, which is in Eritrea. And from there, they went on up to Jeddah, which would have been the port that supported all the material for Mecca. And from there, then that was where the trade came into. We went and shut that one down about 2 years ago. I don't know if you saw on our Pfanderfilms, Mel was part of that as well. We shut down the whole idea that they could have gone up through the sea, just because when you look at Jeddah, you will see that Jeddah has nothing to. Jeddah was only created in the 8th century as a place to provide provisions for Mecca, which had been chosen for the sanctuary. They needed a place to bring the food and the water, and that's why Jeddah was created. And that it didn't exist prior to the 8th century. However, what was fascinating is where the trade did go up to the Red Sea. And the trade went up all along the western coast. It went up along Ethiopia. What is today Ethiopia? It went up along what we know as Sudan. And the five ports on the western coast: Asab, Ajalis, Suakin, Berenice, and Safaga. Those 5 are all well known. There is historical records that go right back to the 3rd century BC and up until the 1st century AD for all those 5 ports, and they're all equidistant 1 day's ride by or 1 day's sail by boat. Now,
Wow.
so none of the trade went on the eastern coast; it all went on the western coast. It was all well documented. These are all historical. Nothing at all for Jeddah, and nothing at all for Mecca.
And I guess why, just to add to that, why would they even consider the east side of the Red Sea, given there's a historical precedent for using the west side because there's already established places to go? You wouldn't bother going to the east if there's already been these established ports that go back hundreds of years prior to this. You simply would have used those. And I think Montgomery's theory of trade through Mecca has been completely abandoned now because of Patricia Crone's work
in 1987.
Absolutely amazing stuff. And I just want to quickly address David Bond here. Patricia Crone claimed that Muhammad never existed, but later on admitted Muhammad existed. There's video of a statement that she was wrong in her hypothesis of the existence of Muhammad. Well, like we said before, we're not necessarily committed to any position on the existence of Muhammad as such. We could perhaps say there was a Muhammad of some kind, but he certainly wasn't the Muhammad of Mecca. He certainly wasn't the Muhammad of the traditional narrative. And so for that reason, we're comfortable either way. What we're really addressing here is Mecca and the implications that derive from that. So thank you for your comment, David.
Let me just go once. Let me just say something about what David's bringing up here, and it's a good point what David's coming up with. And this is the problem that we all have as researchers. When she and Michael Cook wrote Hagerism in 1977, if you look, most people just read the first chapter, and that's all they do. They just read the first chapter, the first synthesis, where she comes out with her what if scenario. She says this is a what if scenario. This is what we know in 1977 from all the artifacts, all the material that we have. And she made a few mistakes, obviously, because when she interpreted, what she interpreted was not what she later found out. And this is the problem with any of us who are doing research. It's become a problem for Mel and me, hasn't it, Mel? We're now saying that whenever we take a position on anything, we put a date on it. And the reason we put a date on it is because what we said in 2023, we may not say in 2024 as new evidence comes to light. Evidence has always come to light, and there are so few of us who are really confronting this area. How many people do you know who are confronting Mecca historically? Well, you could number them on two hands. I don't know of more than 10 people who are confronting Mecca who in the last 20 to 30 years, and there's a good reason for it. When you confront Mecca, you get enormous amount of vitriol. You get an enormous amount of harassment, and you get death threats. Dr. Patricia Crone had to leave Oxford University and move to Cambridge University. When I was with her in 1995, before I did my debate with Dr. Jamal Badawi, I spent an afternoon with her getting my 10 points for that debate in her office. And I said, this is all your material. Why aren't you debating this? And she looked at me and just started laughing. She says, listen, Jay, I have a chair to protect. I have an institution I represent. I cannot debate this in public, but you can. You don't have any chair to protect. You don't have any institution. You have only one institution that you represent, and that's Jesus Christ. And she saw something that the penny dropped for me, but she saw something that I wasn't even looking at. Many of these academics, what they say could destroy not only their job. They could be thrown out of the university, destroy their salary, and they could also get death threats. She did get a death threat. She had to move to Cambridge. From Cambridge, she then moved to Princeton before she died in 2015. So she has had enormous amount of threats on her. Not many people want to go into this kind of work with that kind of threat. Now, what she said in 1977, and David is correct, she then corrected later on when she realized there is enough reference for this person named Muhammad, but it's not the Muhammad of Arabia. That's what she still stands by. It's not the Muhammad of Mecca. It's not the Muhammad of Islam. The Muhammad of Islam, if you see, the Muhammad of Islam really started to take shape in the end of the 7th century, but took really shape during the Umayyad period, and then was really canonized during the Abbasid period. So the Muhammad that we see today is really from the 9th and 10th century, with its later embellishments still coming on. But that's why when she made that statement in 1977, she made a number of statements there that were what-if scenarios and should have been seen as what-if. In some ways, we still are doing that today. We have to make sure that what we say today, we can then date and say, I did say that in 2023. I no longer say that in 2024. And some of the things we've said in this program in 2023, we may have to change in a year or two, depending on where the evidence takes us. We have to follow the evidence. That's exactly what she did.
Amazing stuff. Just a quick shout out. Thank you to Control Yourself. Thank you for your support. That is much appreciated. You say, my Arabic is a little rusty. Is it pronounced Mecca or Makkah? Is it? I always assumed it was Mecca, but is there a different way of pronouncing that? It's different in Arabic?
Are both correct.
They're both correct. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And also, Karen Thompson, thank you very much for your support.
Can I come in on that question about the existence of Muhammad for a moment? So I have a record here from Thomas the Presbyter, and he basically writes that on Friday, the 4th of February, which would be, and he also gives a year which would translate as 634 AD. There was a battle between the Romans and the Tayyaye of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. Now, what's significant about that is the fact that it's 634. There is a reference to Muhammad, okay. The tribe is wrong. It's Tayyaye, which is an Iraqi tribe. I mentioned this already, but it's worth reiterating. And 634 is the year that the standard Islamic narrative says that Umar began his reign. So that is a major problem for Islam. Who is the person in charge? Is it Umar or Muhammad, or are they the same person? So if you go to the historical records, it does not help Islam one bit. It actually creates more problems than it actually helps.
What it looks like to me is it's no longer a question of, is the standard Islamic narrative wrong, but exactly how wrong is it? Yeah. And the fact that we now have multiple independent attestation that Muhammad or someone called Muhammad was supposedly leading these armies years after 632, after he supposedly died according to the standard Islamic narrative. I think that's devastating.
Yeah, and like it just in passing as well, you have the Cave of Hira is mentioned earlier on. There is a place called Hira in Iraq as well, which is again is another indicator somewhere north. And Tayyaye actually lived in that area as well. So there's definitely something towards that sort of neck of the woods, you know.
All of which are way up in the north, to 600 to 1,000 miles too far north.
Yeah,
there might be a case that we may need to do another talk just on Muhammad. Since we're doing this on Mecca today, we need to do one on the Quran, and we may need to do one on Muhammad as well, because there's so much material that we could throw out about the historicity of Muhammad. And we would like to go through Thomas the Presbyter and all these different reference, if they are references to Muhammad, which Muhammad and who is this Muhammad they're referring to.
Exactly. I actually want to take a quick opportunity to ask you something, Jay, because this has come to me at the corner on multiple occasions, and it's actually a direct attack on Patricia Crone. Many Muslims at the park will tell me that I should reject Patricia Crone's work because she is a fringe minority, that her work is not considered valuable or academically significant. I wonder what you can say about that, and just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think this is what you're going to hear from all Muslim sources. They attack the person then rather than looking at the material. No scholar would say that about Patricia Crone. Muslims are the ones that say that. And what they do is this Islamophobia, hate speech. They always bring that up. As soon as you confront those three things, the book, the man, and the place, you're immediately seen as a hate speaker. You're immediately seen as Islamophobe, which is fascinating to me, because we don't say the same thing about the people who confront Christianity. Isn't it fascinating? Can you imagine, since the 1800s, when Wellhausen was attacking the historicity of Jesus, when he was attacking the crucifixion, when he was attacking the scriptures, the documentary hypothesis that he introduced in the late 1800s, did you hear anybody responding that he's a hate speaker or that he is a Christianophobe? That word didn't even exist. It still doesn't exist today. We took it on willingly. And this is the beauty. In the last 100 years, we've been able to find responses to every one of Wellhausen's historical attacks. Also, the school of Tübingen, there's been an enormous amount of attack against Jesus and the Bible, and of course, against the gospel account. What's fascinating is that Christians, rather than sit there and confront the person, they actually found the evidence. They went back and found the evidence. And that's why we are able to know who Jesus was, where he lived, what he did, where he died, even how he rose again. And we can do that using historical evidence. We couldn't back at the time of Wellhausen. We can now today because they asked the right questions. Now we're asking, if you notice, almost every question we're asking today are the same questions that have been asked of Jesus Christ. They're the same questions. We're doing source criticism. We did that today. We did form criticism. We even did a little bit of textual criticism with David's question. So we're actually using the exact same type of criticisms that we're confronting the Christianity with. We're now demanding of Islam. Fascinating. The only response you're getting at Speaker's Corner is this woman's a fringe person. Well, I would suggest that maybe possibly when Wellhausen came out with that, he was probably seen as fringe, but yet he held a strong chair in Germany. Nobody ever considered or confronted his authority. Same way with Goldziher or Schacht or Noldecky. These are the great German scholars. All of them are saying the same thing. No one sits there and confronts them. Interestingly, they are the ones now who are using have taken much of the same material that was confronting Christianity and now is asking this Islam. This has come up over and over again, and I think for an awful lot of the people at Speaker's Corner, they just are not following the scholarly debate. There is a case that when Patricia Crone did come back, I want to look at the date now. She came back in I don't quote me on this. I think maybe early 2000s. She came back to her alma mater, School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, there in central London. And I went to hear her talk, and I assumed that she was going to go to her alma mater, which is where she graduated from. They would not allow her to come to SOAS. She had to go around the block to about 3 blocks away to another hall that was packed out with people, many of them scholars. And that caused such a furore that her own alma mater wouldn't let her come back. And the reason why was because of Muslims who threatened that if she were to come back, they would be outside to demonstrate against her. So that's the problem. I think Muslims just don't know how to do with criticism. They don't know what to do with historical criticism, that they use ad hominem. This is ad hominem. This is a typical case. Whenever you use ad hominem, then you've lost the debate. And it says to me that whenever I hear Muslims bring this up about Patricia Crone, whenever I say, well, what is it about Christian Crone that puts her on the fringes? What is it she said that puts her on the fringes? Look at her book. Even look at Hagerism. When you look at Hagerism, almost half the page of every one of those, half the page of is footnotes. It's the footnotes that you cannot confront. And it's the footnotes that are most valuable. Her interpretation of those footnotes you can confront. And we need to do so because the interpretation will change from decade to decade. But you certainly can't confront her research.
That's quick. Go on, Mel.
I was just going to say, just to back up the whole thing. Well, what is the main difference between Christians and Muslims? I think a characteristic of Christians is we love the truth, because one of the things Jesus says is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And for us, it's personal. We actually value it. I think the question has to be asked of Muslims, do you love the truth? And if you do, you should be listening to us. You shouldn't be running away from what we discover. And you should be actually doing this work. Why are we doing this research? Why are Muslims not doing this research? That's the big question.
And just to jump in there as well, why is it that there's in some cases it's actually academics and scholars who are trying to hide things from Muslims? So, for example, the fact that there's all these skyscrapers being built in Mecca, and there's no talk about the fact that there's no archaeological evidence being found in regards to claims made by Islamic theology is significant, right? We don't find this, and it's because, well, they don't want to talk about it.
And they don't want to talk about it because of the death threats. This is the problem. I don't know of any other area of research where you can be killed for what you say. If you have any doubt, look at Salman Rushdie. They're still trying to kill him. Look what happened last September. And he wrote his book in 1998. We're in 2022 when he was attacked last September. Can you see the difficulty, folks? There's no other area where you will be vilified, you will be hated, you will be threatened to death. And there's the number of people who have been killed. Tasneem al-Nasreen had to flee Bangladesh because she dared to ask, just looking at the different Mecca versus Medina material, something that's internal to the Quran. And I think those of us who are in the West, who are scholars, who are trying to find the evidence, what we do find, we have to be careful how we play it out. Many of the scholars have to put on pseudonyms. Luxembourg, that's not his real name. He has to use that name and not put any picture of him, because he's fearful of what happened to Salman Rushdie will happen to him. And I think this is the difficult. Look what happened to Gunther Lulling. Gunther Lulling in 1970, when he came up and found out that many of the beautiful poetry that's in the Quran can be traced right back to Aramaic hymns, Christian hymns written in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, proving that this has just been borrowed and yet had been bastardized by the Arabic that was then imposed onto it. He not only lost his seat there, in fact, he got the highest grade you can get in Germany, and yet he was given no position at any institution. He went into obscurity, and for 30 years he was in obscurity there in Germany because of his book that he's written. No other scholar I know in any other field would get that kind of treatment. Only those of us who are trying to confront Islam, trying to confront the historicity of both the book, the man, and the place, we get that kind of vitriol. You saw it at Speaker's Corner. Chris, you're still getting that at Speaker's Corner. It's toned down some since 9/11, thank goodness. But certainly this idea that Patricia Krohn or anybody else is on the fringes, just ask any scholar and see if anybody can equal her work. Look at any scholar that is able to read as much as she was able to read, that knows as many languages. The only person I know that can equal her was Dr. Robert Hoyland, who read and wrote 18 languages. But in order to confront her, in order to deal with her, you're going to have to be able to know have that capacity to know that many languages, to be able then to quote against her. And so far, nobody has come up with any evidence to show where she is wrong, to show where she has been incorrect with the evidence she's showing. Her interpretation, yes, but even she admits that.
Go on, Mel. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was going to address that question if you want to ask.
Sure. Yeah.
What about the so-called cave in Mecca? Well, the interesting thing when I was looking into it, I know there's a scholar whose name escapes me that has found a story contemporary to the 7th century. I think it was written in England, if I remember correctly. But going back further, though, to the time of it's not Saint Anthony. Which guy am I thinking of? The saint associated with Carthage. His name is. I'm going to say Saint Anthony, but I think I may have got it wrong. Saint Augustine, yeah. So Saint Augustine, there is a story of him in the moment of his conversion. It's remarkably similar, because he's basically in a garden, and the Bible is with him. The page flicks open, and a voice says to him, "Read, read, read." And so you have in the story of the Hira cave, recite, recite, recite. And I think there have been lots of different versions based on that sort of anecdote that have kind of they've added bits and pieces over the centuries. But it's a pity I can't remember that. Someone probably watching knows the name of the scholar who has written about this. So if you know who I'm referring to. I think it was something like, was it Beowulf or something like that? No, it probably wasn't Beowulf. But anyway, that's all I can say about that I can remember at the minute. Back to you.
Okay, I'm going to read out this question we have here, or more of a statement, really. Why would Muslims make up the story that Mecca was the origin of Islam and birthplace of Muhammad? And then you have a little emoticon there.
Go ahead. You want to answer that one?
I would just like to start on. So actually, go on, Mel. You go on this.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So Mel probably has a lot more detail here, but I think it's important to remember we're not kind of saying that there was some sort of grand conspiracy to sort of come up with something. But rather it was much more organic, and it took place over probably many years, and it was done so for political reasons, perhaps issues of having a national identity. Something that a lot of people talk about is when you had what was effectively the Byzantium Empire that had control over Israel at the time, over Jerusalem. When that fell, it fell to the invading Arabic armies. These armies now had to figure out how to deal with a population that had Christians and Jews, and they had to reconcile how they understood themselves and how they understood the people they were governing. And you could think of perhaps the Quran and these narratives about Mecca and about all these places as kind of being a way of establishing an identity. They needed a place, they needed a man, they needed a book. How did they come up with this? Well, perhaps they borrowed stories that they knew were not considered revelation, but were in some way tied to it. And perhaps they gathered them, and perhaps this took place, and perhaps there was someone who organized some aspects of the gathering, and perhaps it changed over many hundreds of years. I think these things are completely possible and probably quite likely given the evidence that we know and the evidence we brought up tonight. I'll pass over to you, Mel.
Yeah, I think a large part of it has got to do with there was messianic expectations in the 7th century. The Arabs thought that they were going to take over from the Jews and the Messiah was going to return, and their messianic expectations failed them, and it brought about a crisis. And Abdul al-Malik, I think, tried to reignite the fervor again, but then it kind of fell flat. And then sometime between 700 and 730, they decided to start from scratch and take a blank canvas, move everything to a deserted area, and then just transplant all of the religious ideas and imagery and stories, plonk it down there where no one could question what they were believing in and what they had to say. They didn't have Jews and Christians laughing at their suggestions. And then they could generate their Las Vegas in the desert, essentially. You know,
I do like that way of thinking about it, like
Las Vegas in the desert. That's
ancient
Dubai in
Las
the
Vegas.
desert. There's another one. Now, and I think what Chris and Mel said is absolutely important. Remember, when you look at what's happening politically on the ground, you now have a large figure. Abd al-Malik is really important in this. Abd al-Malik, you have to have someone who is huge, strong, and he is seen as the great Arab reformer. He is the one that now has controls all the way from Tripoli in the west all the way to Afghanistan in the east, from Turkey in the north all the way down to Yemen in the south. That's a huge swath of land. He is the great superpower with one other superpower that's bothering him, and that's Byzantine. The Byzantium Empire is the only other superpower. Now, here's the problem. The Byzantines are Christians. They have a prophetic line. The Arabs do not have a prophetic line. The Byzantines have a holy book. The Arabs do not have a holy book. Yet they control the holy places. They now control Jerusalem. So you can see the difficulty. They've got to, their cousins, the Jews and the Christians, have a prophetic line and also two books that they don't have. So what are you going to do? How are you going to compete with them? You now control their holy places. You control more land than they do, and yet you don't have what they have. How do you create an Arab identity? Well, you start by taking their book and deforming it and borrowing it and taking it from many different many different sources and putting it into the Arabic. Now the Arabic becomes the lingua franca for the whole empire. Before that, it was Aramaic. Arabic was spoken by the proletariat, but the people who were in control, the people who were in the cities, the bishops and all the seminaries were all in Aramaic. But Aramaic is very similar to Arabic. The difficulty is Arabic was so crude at that time. It didn't have any dots and vowels. You couldn't read it. It only had 14 consonants. And so that's why they had problem trying to get anything that would be equivalent. But they borrow right and left and center. And that's why the Quran is full of borrowings. We haven't even got into that yet. But once you do that, you then realize you can't keep it in either Petra or Jerusalem. You've got to find your own place. You've got to go to where, as Mel has said, and as Chris has said before that, you've got to go where there's no history. You've got to go to a place that is distinctly Arabic. And by this time, you now control all of the Arab Peninsula. You put it down to where there is no history. You put it where there is no place that can be a stumbling block, much like Las Vegas was created in the middle of the desert. Dubai has been created in the middle. Look at Dubai 20 or 30 years, or maybe 50 years ago. It's just desert. But look at it today. It just blooms. And so the same way they wanted with Mecca, they wanted a place where there was no history. But more than that, they wanted to reproduce what had been historical. And that's why you can see the Kaaba was brought in. That's why the Safa and the Marwa, the Zamzam well, the Pool of Siloam, all these things were recreated as facsimiles. Now you've got the place. But also, and this is what we haven't talked about, is the Black Stone. You have to follow the Black Stone. Black stone goes all the way back from the Phoenician times. We haven't done this and we haven't put it up on Pfanderfilms yet, but this was the black stone that Elagabalus brought to Damascus. And Elagabalus in the 2nd century made the idea that wherever the black stone is, God's presence is there. Where the black stone is God's presence. That black stone used to be in Petra when Ibn Zubair in 687 rebelled against Abd al-Malik and destroyed much of Petra. He took the black stone and then went down to the south. Well, where do you think he went to? He went to where he came from. His problem was he needed allies. Where are you going to get allies? Well, go up to Ctesiphon, go straight north, go up to what is now Baghdad. That was called Ctesiphon. That's where the Abbasids were. The Abbasids saw their chance and they realized, wow, let's get where the black stone is, and we can start to go and keep the black stone with us. Because remember, wherever the black stone is where the pilgrims went. And the pilgrims stopped going up north. They started coming down south. They started coming to where Ibn Zubair was. The Abbasids saw their chance. They took the black stone. They then made Mecca what it was today. And that's why the Abbasids, when they come to power in 749, Mecca becomes the center of the world. But the problem is there is no history. That's the problem. There is no story. There is no backstory. Now they've got the book. Now they've got the man. They've got to create a backstory for him. So what do? Well, they have Ibn Ishaq write his story. That's in 765. He writes it before 765. That's within 15 years. They now have the biography. The problem is there's lots of problems with that biography. So 70 years later, Ibn Hisham then takes that biography and he admits it. He says it. I threw out much of what I didn't like and put down what I did like. But what most people don't know, what you're going to hear for the first time, Chris, is that Ibn Hisham's biography doesn't come from Ibn Hisham. Where does Ibn Hisham's biography come from? Any of you know?
I do not know.
I know, but
a German scholar named Wustenfeld who put it together in 1860. Between 1858 and 1860, a German scholar in Germany went to 4 different German cities, went to the libraries, and went into the museums of those 4 cities in Germany, and he grabbed as much as he could about this man named Muhammad and put it into a story and published it in 1860, and that's what we then have today, was then taken over by our good friend here. If I have it here, it's somewhere here. Our good friend Guillaume. That's the one that everybody uses. This is the biography that is used by everybody in the world today. It says Ibn Ishaq. It was not Ibn Ishaq. It's not even Ibn Hisham. It's Wustenfeld that created this biography. And this is the standard biography that we use all over the world today. It didn't exist prior to 1860. That's a little over 160 years ago, folks. So even that we're finding is not from the 9th century. So by the 9th century, then you start to get Al-Bukhari in 870. Then he put all this. But remember, Muslims tell us this. He was given 600,000 of these stories, right? That supposedly this man Muhammad said. And he whittled them down throughout 98% of it, and only was left only 7,397. That's just 2%. What happened to the other 98%? What happened to the other 598,000 that we like to see today, or 595,000? What happened to them? They've just been destroyed. Proving that
exactly,
this was a censorship on whole scale censorship that was going on by the Abbasids. And that's why we said at the very beginning of this program, you notice what we started out with. Mecca is really an Abbasid invention. Muhammad is really an Abbasid invention. The Quran is really an Abbasid book. The book, The Man and the Place, is really an Abbasid book, an Abbasid man and an Abbasid place. And it all really is put together by the 9th century, 833, then 870, 875, up until 923, the 10th century. We now have the Islam that we have in our hands today. But that's 200 to 300 years way too late. It's not the Islam of history. It's the Islam of the Abbasids from Baghdad. And that's why, folks, if you're a Muslim, it's hard to hear this. I understand it, because pretty much it shuts down your book, your man, and your place. You are not, there's really nothing left for you. If you shut this down historically, where are you going to go to? Well, we'll tell you where you can go to. We'll probably end our show with that. Back to you, Chris.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's a really good way to sort of summarize the position that Muslims today find themselves in. It's not a comfortable one. It's a very dangerous, very shaky ground that their foundation is based on. Without this Mecca, there cannot be a real Muhammad from Mecca. There cannot be a Quran that is meant to be revealed in Mecca. There cannot be a Hira cave in Mecca. Everything is on that basis. It is questioned because we have this evidence. I haven't heard this new stuff about that German scholar who it's supposedly the earliest Surah didn't come from Ibn Ishaq or even Ibn Hisham, but from a German scholar. That's really, really interesting news to me. That stuff's amazing. We know now that the sin has been completely destroyed, completely dealt with. I've been challenging Muslims here in the comments to say anything about this and to come on live. Haven't had a single person want to do that. I think we've had up to about 273 people live at one time, and not a single Muslim felt confident enough to challenge what we're saying here. And I think that really shows that the best they can do is they can pivot and they can talk about things like the Birmingham portfolio, which Jay, I think you shot that down in a few minutes, and that was brilliant. So I think that's a great way to end this. I think we're coming up to 11 now, so we've been here for about
just to end this off.
Sure.
Listen, to Muslims, I want to talk to Muslims. We're not here to shut down anything. We're not here to confront you in any way other than the fact that we're demanding of you what was demanded of us. And we understand that this is difficult to hear, that if Mecca did not exist until the 8th century, or at least the end of the 7th century going into the 8th century, if this is not a place that Muhammad lived, or if there even was a Muhammad, there are many, it's a common name, it means the praised one. Many people were called the praised one back in the 7th century. But if this Muhammad never lived in Mecca, if the Quran never came from Mecca or Medina or the Hijaz, if this is the case, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? There's a difficulty here. You're going to have to come to some conclusion, but please, please, please don't give up. Please don't give up. Just because we've shut down Mecca, just because we're shutting down Muhammad, and just because we're shutting down the Quran historically, please, for heaven's sakes, you don't have to leave and just say throw up your hands, because you can come home. You can come home. This is something we've been saying for years. This is something I've always said. There is another book. There is another man. There is another place that has passed every one of these tests. The man you know is Jesus Christ. The book is his gospel. It's the Bible. And the place is Jerusalem. We know it because every one of the three of us have already met Jesus Christ personally. We know who he is. He has had huge impact on our lives. But at the same time, because of the fact that we are scholars who demand research and demand historical support for what we're saying, we have to demand the same thing that we've asked of Islam. We have to demand the same thing of Christianity. Fortunately, in some ways, we're 200 years ahead of the game. Now, back in 1995, when I did my first debate with Dr. I can't remember his name right now. He asked, and he looked at me, Jamal Badawi, Dr. Jamal Badawi. After I gave 10 historical challenges, all came from Patricia Corona, he looked at me and says, Mr. Smith, everything you're talking about is based on hearsay. It's based on no evidence. He says, okay, so we don't have the evidence for any of these things. But the absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence, he said. And he was correct. Certainly in 1995, when we had this debate 27 years ago, 28 years ago now, he was correct. Just because there was no evidence in the 7th and 8th century doesn't mean that you won't find evidence at some point. Now, that was 1995. Today, now, the debate has completely changed. We flipped it on its head. See, we're not arguing from absence of evidence anymore. It's not an absence of evidence. That's what we said in 1995. In 2023, we have all kinds of evidence. We have an enormous amount of evidence. We haven't even got into it today. We haven't looked at the coins. We haven't looked at the manuscripts. We haven't looked at all the rock inscriptions. There's so much evidence now that's coming to the fore that's proving that there was not a man named Muhammad, nor a book called the Quran, nor a place called Mecca in the 7th century. Not in the 7th century. In the 8th and 9th century, redacted back to the 7th century, yes, but not in the 7th century. So now, suddenly, the debate has completely changed. And now, in some ways, we're in the driving seat. But for Muslims, just because you cannot come up with evidence, and you're never going to find evidence, listen, that was 28 years ago, and still no one has found evidence for Mecca. And I asked that back in 1995. Patricia Crone was asking that in 1977. You're not going to find any support for Mecca in the 7th century. Don't give up. Come on home. Come on back to Jesus Christ, because he has been proven historically. But more than historical critique, he is someone that you want to get to know, because he has all the answers you're looking for. He has everything that you need. And because what he did on the cross, dying on the cross 2,000 years ago, and that did happen 2,000 years ago, but not just dying on Friday, that's the day you celebrate, he then rose on Sunday. And because of rising from the dead, he destroyed all the sin. He took away all of our guilt, and he's waiting to also welcome you home. That's all you have to do. It doesn't cost you a thing. All you have to do is recognize that there was a historical Jesus. He did historically die. He did historically rise again. And because of that, he's taken care of everything you need to have salvation and to come home with him for eternity. We offer that. Mel offers that. I offer that. And so does Chris. We're all of one accord on this. We have confronted historically Mecca. Now, you come home to the person who answers every one of your questions. His name is Jesus Christ.
Amen. That is beautifully put, Jay. And I think, obviously, I completely agree, and I'm sure you do as well, Mel.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of wrapping it up. We've just about hit time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will... yeah, we're deeply thankful for having you on, so we could talk about the Islamic narrative about Mecca and give our challenges to that, and have these presented to you and have your feedback. Thank you for anyone that also challenged us as well on that. We do appreciate criticism, because we do think that God is truth, and that through truth we can find that Jesus is Lord, and we can come back to him. So thank you very much, and I'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone.
God bless you.